The history of warfare is often written in the names of kings, emperors, and generals, men who moved armies like chess pieces across the maps of empires. But in the Canadian story, one of the most feared and respected combat units ever to fix bayonets carries the name of a young woman known for her quiet Victorian grace, her love of oil painting, and her royal lineage. Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. To the uninitiated, the name sounds like a relic of a bygone era, perhaps belonging to more of a tea set or a gilded ballroom invitation than a modern battlefield. But to those who have worn the red patch, and to the enemies who have faced them across the broken ground of three continents, that name carries a very different resonance. It's a name that sounds like the rhythmic, heavy rattle of a Vickers machine gun in the waist-deep mud of Flanders. It sounds like the desperate, rasping shout for ammunition on a frozen, starlit hilltop in Korea. It sounds like the low, predatory rumble of a LAV-3 moving through the choking, fine-grained dust of Panjwai. How did a regiment named for royalty become the iron fist of the Canadian military? How did a privately raised unit of frontiersmen and Boer War veterans evolve into the vanguard of modern Canadian defense? To understand the Patricias, one must understand that they were never just another unit of the line. They were born of a private citizen's checkbook, baptized in the industrial scale slaughter of the Great War, and forged into an unbroken line of service that stretches from the summer of 1914 to the modern day. From their first moments, they lived the motto that would define them: first in the field. Not as a slogan, but as a way of being. They were the first to deploy, the first to take their place in the trenches, the first to stand where the danger was the greatest. And over time, another truth emerged, spoken quietly, carried proudly, and understood deeply by every man and woman who has ever worn the Rickettam. Once a Patricia, always a Patricia. Because the regiment is not simply a formation, it is a lineage, a bond, promise, a thread that ties the originals of 1914 to the paratroopers of today, a legacy that does not end when the uniform comes off. This is the story of the PPCLI, a regiment that has always been and remains first in the field and forever Patricia. The year was 1914. The world was standing on the precipice of a madness it did not yet understand. In Ottawa, while the government scrambled to figure out the logistics of total war, one man decided he could not wait for the slow, grinding wheels of bureaucracy to turn. His name was Andrew Hamilton Galt. He was a millionaire, a veteran of the South African War, and a man who believed that when the empire called, you didn't just answer, you led the way. Galt walked into the offices of the Minister of Militia and Defense with an extraordinary offer. He would personally provide $100,000, a staggering sum in 1914, equivalent to millions today, to raise, equip, and maintain a regiment of infantry for overseas service. But Galt didn't want green recruits. He didn't want idealistic boys looking for an adventure that would be over by Christmas. He wanted what he called the originals. He put out a call across the Dominion of Canada. He wanted men who had already seen the elephant. He wanted veterans of the Boer War. He wanted former British regulars who had settled in the West, frontiersmen, and Northwest Mounted Police officers. The response was overwhelming. In just 8 days, 3,000 men showed up at Lansdowne Park in Ottawa. These were hard men, many in their 30s and 40s, their faces lined by the sun of the veldt or the wind of the prairies. Galt and his recruiters handpicked the best 1,000. Because of this concentrated experience, the PPCLI became the first Canadian infantry unit to land in France. While the rest of the Canadian Expeditionary Force was still training on the windswept plains of Salisbury Hill, the Patricias were already in the trenches. Before they left, the Governor General's daughter, Princess Patricia of Connaught, did something that would define the regiment's identity forever. She didn't just lend her name. She hand-stitched their camp color, a crimson flag with the royal blue center and her own gold monogram. The soldiers called it the Ricadamdu, a name traditionally said to have had Gallic roots, though its exact meaning has been lost to time. To the men, it was more than a banner, it was a piece of home and a symbol of a personal bond with their namesake. They carried that color into every battle of 1915 and beyond, guarding it with such devotion that even when enemy fire buried it in the earth, it was recovered and carried forward again. The originals brought experience to the front, but nothing could have prepared them for the Second Battle of Ypres in May of 1915. This was the transition point of human history where 19th century notions of glory met the 20th century reality of industrial slaughter. The Patricias were holding a section of the line called the Frezenberg Ridge. They were a thin line of men in shallow, waterlogged trenches facing a German army that had just introduced the world to the horror of chemical weapons. On May 8th, the German artillery began a bombardment that survivors described not as a series of explosions, but as a continuous physical roar that shook the very foundation of the earth. This was drum fire, artillery so rapid and concentrated that individual shells couldn't be distinguished. Lieutenant Agar Adamson, an original officer who survived the day, wrote in a letter home to his wife, quote, "The earth is being turned over like a plowed field. There is no trench left, only a series of shallow holes where men huddle until they are buried alive." End quote. The German objective was to smash the Ypres salient. The Patricias stood in their way. By 10 o'clock a.m., the front-line trenches had been obliterated. Lieutenant Colonel Buller, the regiment commander, was killed by a shell fragment while moving between positions to encourage his men. Command then fell to Major Galt, but within the hour, he too was severely wounded, his left leg shattered. The battle became a series of isolated, desperate stands. Communication was impossible. Telephone wires were shredded, and runners were killed before they could move even 20 yards. Small groups of Patricias, led by corporals and privates, fought with a savage intensity. When their machine guns, the heavy Vickers, were buried by shell fire, the men dug them out with their bare hands, wiped away the grit, and kept firing until the barrels hissed and glowed in the damp air. By mid-afternoon, the Germans had breached the unit on the Patricias' flanks. The regiment was now being fired upon from 3 sides, yet they didn't retreat. They formed a refused flank, turning their line into a jagged U shape to keep the enemy out of the rear areas. When the ammunition ran low, men crawled through the churned up earth to strip pouches from their fallen comrades. When night finally fell, the ridge was still held, but the cost was a generation of men. Of the 700 Patricias who had entered the line that morning, only 150 remained standing. The originals, the veterans of Africa, the mounted police, and the raw frontiers of Canada, had been decimated. But they'd achieved the impossible. They'd held the gateway to Ypres. Talbot Papineau, a soldier, lawyer, Rhodes Scholar, one of the early Patricias, saw something remarkable in the regiment during the First World War, and this is noteworthy. In a country still divided by language, region, and identity, Papineau was struck by how French and English-speaking Canadians fought side by side in the trenches. The regiment formed a unity that the young nation itself had not yet achieved back home. In the mud of Flanders, though, Canadians discovered each other. Sadly, Papineau did not survive World War I and his remains were lost. But while in PPCLI and in the mud of World War I and the Ypres salient, he wrote, "There was no room for old divisions."
July 28, 1916. As I write, French and English Canadians are fighting and dying side by side. Is their sacrifice to go for nothing, or will it not cement a foundation for a true Canadian nation? Independent in thought, independent in action? As a minority in a great English-speaking continent, we must rather seek to find points of contact and of common interest than points of friction and separation.
And nowhere was that unity tested more fiercely than at Frezenberg. Frezenberg became more than a battle, it became a ghost that walked with the regiment for a century. A reminder of what it meant to be a Patricia. You did not leave your post. You did not yield to fear or fire. You stayed until the world ended. And if it didn't, you stood up, wiped the mud from your rifle, and prepared to do it again. For Papineau and for every Patricia who survived that day, Frezenberg was not just a moment of crisis, it was the moment that the regiment's identity was forged, a place where Canadians of every background held the line together, not because they were the same, but because they were Patricias. That spirit, unity in purpose, steadiness under fire, became the thread that carried the regiment through every battlefield that followed. The regiment would rebuild, but the shadow of Frezenberg would remain, a silent standard against which every Patricia measured themselves. 1 year later, in June 1916, the Patricias found themselves once again in the crucible, this time at Sanctuary Wood. The name suggests peace, but the reality was a cauldron of splintered trees, shattered trenches, and unending shell fire. On June 2nd, a massive German bombardment struck the Patricia lines. A direct hit obliterated battalion headquarters. In the chaos, the regiment's most sacred symbol, the ricadam was buried beneath the collapsed dugout. The color Princess Patricia had sewn with her own hands, the banner carried through every battle since 1915, vanished under the churned earth. For a moment, it seemed as though the regiment had lost not just a flag, but a piece of its soul. But when the shelling finally eased, survivors clawed through the wreckage with bare hands. They dug through mud, splintered beams, and the bodies of their friends until they found it. Torn, blackened, and caked with earth, the color was lifted from the ground like a wounded comrade. It was carried out of the line with reverence, damaged beyond repair but unbroken in spirit, just like the men who'd saved it. Sanctuary Wood became the moment when the regiment's identity crystallized. The Patricias did not abandon their colors. They did not abandon each other, even when the earth itself tried to swallow them. They dug their way back to the light. We're going to move on now to the interwar period, one of rebuilding the regiment, rebuilding the nation. The guns of the Great War fell silent in 1918, but for the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, the end of the fighting did not mean the end of the struggle. The regiment that returned home was not the same one that had marched proudly out of Ottawa in 1914. The originals were gone, buried in the mud of Frezenberg, Sanctuary Wood, and Passchendaele. What remained was a name, a legacy, and a handful of veterans determined to rebuild both. The interwar years were a time of reflection and reconstruction. Canada, like much of the world, was exhausted. The nation turned inward, focused on healing wounds, both visible and unseen. The military shrank dramatically, and the PPCLI, once 1,000 strong, was reduced to a cadre of professionals tasked with keeping the flame alive. Yet, even in these quiet years, the regiment refused to fade. They trained relentlessly, maintaining the standards that had defined them in France and Flanders. They patrolled the vast Canadian West, assisted in domestic emergencies, and served as a stabilizing force during moments of civil unrest. The Patricias became a symbol of continuity in a country searching for its post war identity. In 1927, the regiment received a new home at Fort Osborne Barracks in Winnipeg. It was here that a new generation of Patricias learned the stories of the originals. Stories not told in textbooks, but in the quiet authority of the men who had survived the Great War. The Rickettamboo, damaged and blackened from its burial at Sanctuary Wood, was placed under careful preservation. It became a relic of sacrifice, a reminder of what the regiment had endured and what it must never forget. The Great Depression brought hardship across the country, but Patricias endured. They remained small, but they remained steady and ready. The regiment's identity, professional, disciplined, quietly lethal, was sharpened in these lean years. They were no longer the hastily assembled band of frontiersmen and veterans that Galt had raised in 1914. They were becoming something new, a permanent, modern infantry regiment prepared for whatever the next storm might bring, and that storm was coming. By the late 1930s, as tensions rose in Europe and the world edged once more toward catastrophe, the Patricias expanded, trained, and prepared. The lessons of the Great War were etched into their doctrine, their discipline, and their culture. When Canada again answered the call in 1939, the PPCLI did not need to be forged. They were already tempered. The regiment that stepped forward into the Second World War was lean, experienced, and unshakably professional. The quiet years between the wars had not diminished them, they had refined them. The Patricias were ready. In 1943, the Patricias landed in Sicily as part of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division. The campaign was a furnace of heat, dust, and unforgiving terrain. The regiment fought its way across the island's ridges and dry riverbeds, pushing north into the Italian mainland. Italy would become one of the most brutal and overlooked theaters of the war. Mountain after mountain, town after town, each one defended by seasoned German troops who knew how to use the terrain to their advantage. But it was the ancient seaside town of Ortona that the Patricias faced one of their greatest trials. By December 1943, Ortona had become a fortress. The Germans, specifically the elite 1st Parachute Division, had turned the medieval streets into a maze of rubble, booby traps, and interlocking machine gun nests. Every doorway was wired with explosives. Every intersection was covered by snipers. The streets were killing zones. So the Patricias refused to use the streets. They invented a new way to fight. Using beehive charges, explosive cones designed to blast through masonry, they punched holes through the walls of adjoining houses. Instead of advancing down through the open streets, they moved through the buildings themselves, room to room, floor to floor, house to house. This tactic, later known as mouse holing, became a hallmark of Canadian urban warfare. It was slow, suffocating, close in combat. Grenades, bayonets, and the Bren gun ruled the day. The Patricias fought not for blocks, but for kitchens, stairwells, and bedrooms. Every meter was paid for in blood. By the time Ortona was secured, the regiment had earned a reputation as masters of the close quarters fight, calm, methodical, and relentless. Before Ortona, the Patricias had already endured one of the most punishing battles of the Italian campaign, the Gully. The Gully was a deep, natural ravine carved into the Italian countryside, an ideal defensive position. The German 1st Parachute Division held it with machine guns, mortars, and interlocking fields of fire. The terrain was a nightmare: steep walls, thick mud, and no cover. For days the Patricias attacked again and again. They advanced through rain that turned the ground into a sucking mire. They crawled forward under fire so intense it shredded trees into splinters. Platoons were reduced to handfuls of men, and casualties mounted with every assault. It was here that the regiment's grit was tested to its limits. Gully demanded everything: discipline, endurance, and the stubborn refusal to break that had defined the Patricias since Frezenberg. The battle forged the regiment into a force capable of fighting in the most claustrophobic, brutal conditions imaginable. It was a crucible that prepared them for the nightmare of Ortona, for the long road north through Italy. The final push came by 1945. The Patricias had fought their way out of Italy and into northwest Europe. The final months of the war brought them into the Netherlands, a land suffering under years of occupation and starvation. Here, the regiment's role shifted from assault to liberation. They cleared towns and villages one by one, often fighting house to house as they had in Ortona. They crossed flooded fields, advanced along dikes under fire, and pushed the Germans back toward the Rhine. The Dutch civilians, gaunt from the hunger winter, greeted the Patricias with tears, flowers, and open arms. It was in this campaign that Sergeant Aubrey Cozzens earned the Victoria Cross at Mushoff, charging alone into enemy-held houses after his platoon was decimated, turning a looming disaster into a decisive victory. The liberation of the Netherlands was not just a military triumph, it was a humanitarian one. The Patricias brought food, safety, and hope to a population that had endured the unendurable. Their discipline and compassion left a legacy still remembered in Dutch towns today. By the end of the Second World War, the PPCLI had fought from the sun-baked hills of Sicily to the shattered streets of Ortona, through the mud of the gully and the flooded fields of Netherlands. They had crossed continents, liberated towns, and paid dearly for every mile. They emerged from the war not just as veterans of another global conflict, but as a modern, battle hardened infantry regiment, one that had proven itself again and again in the most demanding conditions of the 20th century. And the next test would come sooner than anyone expected, on a cold, forested hilltop in Korea, where the Patricias would once again be asked to hold the line when the world was falling apart. The Patricias emerged from the Second World War as hardened, modern fighting regiment, experience they would carry with them into the new conflict on the Korean Peninsula, where a ridge called Kapyong would demand every lesson they'd ever learned. To understand Kapyong, you must step into the tension of April 1951. The Korean War had become an awful pendulum swinging wildly between advance and disaster. The UN push north had been shattered by the sudden arrival of hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops. South Korean units were breaking apart, the front dissolving into a chaotic retreat that threatened to unravel the entire defense of Seoul. The 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Jim Stone, was ordered to stand fast. Stone was a veteran of the Italian campaign of the Second World War, a calm, methodical commander known for his unshakable belief in holding ground once taken. His orders were clear: defend Hill 677 at all costs. Hill 677 was no gentle rise. It was a rugged, forested peak overlooking the Kapyong River Valley, a natural choke point on the road to Seoul. If the hill fell, the capital would be exposed. By the evening of April 24th, 1951, the Patricias, roughly 600 soldiers, were alone on that height. Across the valley, nearly 3,000 Chinese infantry from the 354th Regiment of the 118th Division were advancing towards them. The South Korean forces on their flank had collapsed. The Australians on the neighboring hill had been forced to withdraw. The Patricias were now an island in a sea of enemy troops, cut off from resupply, surrounded on all sides, their only connection to the outside world a tenuous radio link and the distant rumble of UN artillery. As darkness settled over the valley, the Chinese assault began. Hub Gray spoke with Veterans Affairs Canada about his experience in Kapyong with the PPCLI, and we'll listen to him now.
About 10 o'clock, they attacked our area, coming up behind us. No one heard them. We weren't aware. It was about a battalion, around 500 men. When they were within approximately 60 yards of the crest, and the platoon was on the crest, I was back at some half-track. I spotted them. So I lined it up, gave inflating fire. We were directly at right angle, and it was a slaughter, just a slaughter. As one of my troops said to me at the time, "My God, it looks like somebody kicked the top off an anthill." The next morning we counted in excess of 100 dead. The Chinese had the habit of always pulling back and withdrawing as many of their dead and wounded as possible to deceive us of what we had achieved. So generally speaking, we increased the numbers by 50 or 100%.
Enemy did not come with the Western doctrine of fire and movement. They came in waves, a tide of bodies, signaled by whistles, gongs, and bugles that echoed throughout the blackened hills. The sound was unnerving, a haunting chorus that one Patricia later described as like ghosts calling to each other in the dark. The Patricias fought from their weapon pits, the night lit only by the staccato flash of rifles and the red arc of tracer fire slicing through the trees. The fighting was so close that soldiers could hear the enemy speaking to one another as they advanced. Veteran accounts from that night are harrowing. Private Wayne Mitchell, manning a Bren gun on the forward slope, was wounded twice, once in the arm, once in the leg. He refused evacuation. Instead, he propped himself up against the lip of his trench and continued firing, holding off an entire squad of attackers long enough for his platoon to reposition. His actions were later cited by his comrades as one of the reasons the line held. Between 2008 and 2013, a series of interviews were conducted at the military museums in Calgary with PPCLI veterans who had served in the Second World War and the Korean War. Claude Petit from Duck Lake, Saskatchewan, was another Patricia who was in Korea. So let's hear from him next.
It started about 10 o'clock at night and went on till about 2. Then the trucks came in. We had to move up. We had to do a counterattack to take that position over. But it was a company attack. That's a big attack, you know. So we went up there. We lost 16 men. They lost 76 men. We got the position back, but the colonel of the Black Watch actually called down artillery on his own position. The Chinese overran them because they come in there with thousands of guys, you know. Our position.
But the most legendary moment occurred in the sector held by D Company. Among the 600 Patricias holding Hill 677, D Company occupied the most exposed ground on the forward slope. They were one of the battalion's 4 rifle companies, roughly 120 men divided into 3 platoons, and a small headquarters element. But in the crucible of Kapyong, they were more than an organizational unit. They were the hinge on which the entire defense would turn. As the Chinese assault intensified, elements of the 354th Regiment, roughly 3,000 infantry, pushed up the slopes towards the Patricia lines. The South Korean forces had collapsed, the Australians on the adjacent hill had been forced to withdraw, and the Patricias were completely alone, and D Company was directly in the path of the main attack. Lieutenant Mike Levy, commanding 10 Platoon, was in one of the hardest hit positions. His platoon was being pushed to the brink. Ammunition was running low, the enemy close enough to hear, the line second from collapsing. In that moment, Levy made a decision that would define his courage for the rest of his life. He called for artillery fire to be brought down directly onto his own position. The barrage shattered the assault, and when the smoke cleared, Levy and his men were still there. Hub Gray recalls that night.
They then did a concentrated attack on 10 Platoon headed by Mike Levy. Mike had 25 men in his platoon. He was well under strength. They were dug in, and they were attacked by masses of enemy troops. They were at the top of a fairly steep crest. Mike called for artillery fire. Normally you call for artillery fire, you ask for 10 rounds or 20 rounds or something of that area. The Australians report he called for the most unique fire order they'd ever heard of. He called for the artillery to come in for 40 minutes. He got his men down in the trenches, and he brought the fire down in his own position. It was the only way he could stop the enemy. When he called for that fire, they were within about 7 meters of taking his position.
So, because of Levy's actions that night, the line had held. And despite his actions, Levy did not receive the Military Cross. Later accounts revealed that anti Semitic prejudice from a senior officer played a role in denying him the award, even though Levy did not identify as Jewish. The injustice lingered for decades.
Mike had the calmness and the willpower in battle to assess the situation, visiting his troops, constantly moving through, and he called that artillery fire down at least twice. Mike's battle lasted from originating, I think, around 1 in the morning when they attacked on one front. Then around an hour or so later, they attacked on two fronts. A section of the platoon to his right was another platoon was taken by the enemy. And then at 4, they launched on 4 fronts. As far as I'm concerned, Mike Levy saved my life and the life of the battalion.
That again was Hub Gray speaking with Veterans Affairs Canada. Levy continued to serve with distinction in Germany, Vietnam, Cyprus, Washington, and Ottawa, eventually retiring as a major in 1974. His decorations included the Burma Star, Defense Medal, War Medal with Oak Leaf, Korea Medal, NATO Medal, Canadian Peacekeeping Medal, United Nations Korea Medal, the ICCS Vietnam Medal, the Canadian Forces Decoration, and the United States Presidential Unit Citation. In 2004, he was granted a coat of arms bearing a motto that captured the truth of his life in 3 simple words: I have prevailed. Mike Levy passed away in 2007. His story, escapee, commando, Patricia, survivor, remains one of the most extraordinary in the regiment's long history. For the record, at the same time in that same battle, Captain J.G.W. Mills, commanding D Company as a whole, faced the same crisis, but on a larger scale. As Chinese forces pressed in across the company front, Mills ordered his men into their trenches and requested artillery fire dangerously close, so close that it effectively landed on his own company's position. His decision helped break another major assault and kept the Patricias line intact. So 2 officers, 2 impossible choices, both made in the dark under crushing pressure, both choosing to risk their own lives and the lives of their men to stop a breakthrough that could have shattered the battalion. These moments became part of the regiment's legend. They embodied what it meant to be a Patricia at Kapyong. You held your ground, no matter the cost. You did not yield to fear or fire. You stayed until the world ended, and if it didn't, you stood up, wiped the mud from your rifle, and prepared to do it again. So the artillery came in. High explosive shells detonated directly on the Patricias' trenches. The Canadians sheltered in their deep bunkers, while the Chinese troops on the surface were torn apart by the very artillery meant to protect them. The ground shook like a living thing, one veteran recalled. The Chinese assault faltered, then it broke. D Company held. So when dawn broke on April 25th, Hill 677 was a wasteland of splintered trees and churned earth and scorched brush. Smoke drifted across the shattered slope and bodies lay everywhere, Canadian and Chinese alike, indistinguishable in the gray morning light. But the red patch was still there. 600 Patricias had held against nearly 3,000 attackers. And remarkably, both Captain Mills and Lieutenant Levy survived the night they had been willing to die on. The officers who had ordered artillery to fall dangerously close, so close it tore into their own defensive lines, were still standing when the sun rose over Hill 677. At first light, Mills moved through the shattered trenches of D Company, checking on his soldiers, steadying shaken nerves, and helping reorganize the defense. Levy did the same within 10 platoon, walking among men who had spent the night believing none of them would see morning. Veterans later recalled that both officers carried themselves with the same calm they had shown during the fight, quiet, composed, and utterly unflappable. Their survival became part of the regiment's lore, a reminder that courage does not always end in sacrifice and that sometimes the bravest men live to carry the story forward. Again, let's hear from Claude Petit one more time.
I was going down for blankets and rations, and I stopped at the MA his bunker, and I was talking to him. We had this stuff on a stretcher, and all of a sudden the mortars start coming in, and I had a bulletproof vest on, so I was not too bad. I got hit, and the guy that was carrying the stretcher with me got it in the back, and he didn't have a bulletproof vest on. We were evacuated from there too. I went to the Norwegian Mash. He went out with a chopper. I went out with just one of those ambulance trucks. And got operated on and went back to our own position. And, then I went back to join my company, and next visit they had finished the hook finally. Oh my God! It's on one of the battle honors. We went to the San John Valley. It didn't go too bad, but the guys were already hardened. You know, battle hard. That was a heck of a position.
For their actions at Kapyong, the 2nd Battalion PPCLI was awarded the United States Presidential Unit Citation, the only Canadian unit to ever receive it. Today, when you see a Patricia in dress uniform, you may notice a small, unassuming blue ribbon on their shoulder. It's not worn with fanfare, it's worn with quiet pride. It's the mark of Kapyong. Kapyong was not the end of the regiment's story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. The world that emerged from the Korean War was no longer defined by great armies clashing across continents, but by fragile ceasefires, tense borders, and conflicts that simmered in the shadows of the Cold War. And once again, when the international community needed steady hands and disciplined soldiers, the Patricias were among the first to step forward. From the divided island of Cyprus to the shattered towns of the Balkans, the regiment carried the lessons of Kapyong into a new era, one where courage was measured not only in battle, but in restraint and patience and the quiet professionalism of peacekeeping. Guns fell silent at Kapyong, but the world the Patricias returned to was not at peace. The Cold War had settled over the globe like a long, uneasy twilight. No great battles and no clear front lines, just tension, suspicion, and the constant threat of conflict simmering beneath the surface. It was a different kind of war, one fought not with sweeping offensive, but with patience and discipline, the steady presence of soldiers who understood the value of holding a line. For the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, this new era demanded a different kind of courage. In 1964, the regiment deployed to the divided island of Cyprus, a place where ancient grievances and modern politics had collided with a deadly force. Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots were locked in a cycle of violence, and the United Nations called for peacekeepers who could stand between them with firmness, fairness, and restraint. And the Patricias answered. They traded the frozen slopes of Kapyong for the sun-bleached hills of Nicosia, the roar of artillery for the tense quiet of narrow streets where a single gunshot could ignite a war. Their mission was not to defeat an enemy, but to prevent two sides from destroying each other, and to do it under the watchful eyes of the world. Cyprus became one of the longest and most complex peacekeeping operations in Canadian history. The Patricias patrolled buffer zones. They negotiated ceasefires and escorted civilians through contested areas and stood guard at checkpoints where a wrong word or a nervous gesture could spark violence. They learned to read the mood of a village, to sense when tempers were rising, and to diffuse a confrontation with nothing more than calm voices and steady hands. It was a different battlefield, but it demanded the same discipline and the same professionalism, the same quiet courage that had carried them through the mud of Flanders and the fire of Kapyong. And in Cyprus, as in every theater before it, the Patricias stood their ground. So in 1964, the regiment deployed to Cyprus as part of the newly formed United Nations peacekeeping force in Cyprus. For decades afterwards, this became the public face of the Canadian military, the blue beret, the white jeep, and the quiet, thankless task of standing between Greek and Turkish Cypriots who lived in a state of simmering hostility. It was a mission defined by patience and restraint and the discipline that rarely makes the headlines. In 1978, Mr. Daniel Bradley experienced his first operational deployment to Cyprus with PPCLI. He was interviewed by Veterans Affairs Canada for the Heroes Remember project. And in a moment, we will hear what his day to day routine was like in Cyprus in 1978 and 79.
But the typical day for a soldier is you would, depending on what shift you're on, because the observation posts were manned 24 hours, 7 days a week. So you get up in the morning for your particular shift, or in the evening, or whenever your time was. You would have an inspection, and looking good was very important back in those days. Your boots were shone, your uniform was ironed, even your UN cap was rigidly starched. You'd have your inspection, make sure you knew your duties, jumped on a truck, and then you'd be driven out to your observation post where you and one other team member would occupy the observation post. And your shifts could be anywhere from 8 to 12 hours, depending on the area or the location of the observation post. And you were doing exactly as the title would indicate. You were observing. So you would watch the Turkish line, you would watch the Greek Cypriot line, and you would watch for any change in the positions, the addition of a sandbag, the movement of a vehicle, and all of that had to be reported. And the idea and the concept behind it, which we were quite sensitive to, was that any movement of that type or improvement in the position could provoke a nasty response from the opposite side of the line. So all that was reported back to headquarters, and then they took action with the change of command on either side. So that was really your day's work. You recorded everything down, reported any changes in the line, and waited for your shift change to be over.
In 1992, Mr. Bradley was given another opportunity to deploy to Somalia and joined a contingency from the RCR and became part of the Airborne Regiment, where he held the rank of Chief Warrant Officer. As his military career continued, Mr. Bradley was part of an operational to Croatia in 1994, Bosnia in 1997, and more recently, 2002, 2003, traveled to Afghanistan on 2 different operations. Mr. Bradley retired in 2011 with 35 years of military service. But in 1974, the peacekeeping mission turned into a full-scale combat operation. In July of that year, the Greek military junta in Athens backed a coup against the Cypriot president, Archbishop Makaroy. The island erupted into chaos. Fearing for the safety of the Turkish Cypriot minority, Turkey launched a massive sea and airborne invasion, Operation Attila. What had been a tense but manageable peacekeeping mission instantly became a battlefield. The Patricias of the 1st Battalion found themselves in the middle of a literal crossfire. Their primary responsibility was the Nicosia International Airport, a vital strategic prize. If the airport fell to either side, the UN's ability to maintain a presence on the island would collapse. The Turkish military approached with tanks, armored personnel carriers, and air support. Greek Cypriot forces were dug in around the perimeter, prepared to fight to the last man. The Canadians, led by Colonel Jim Weir, were told in no uncertain terms that the airport must remain a UN-protected area. The Patricias were massively outgunned. They had light arms, a handful of anti-tank weapons, and white-painted APCs, against a division of Turkish infantry supported by M48 Patton tanks. Yet in the spirit of Frezenberg and Kapyong, they didn't move. They drove their white vehicles directly into the dead zone between the 2 armies. They painted enormous UN symbols on the tarmac. They told both sides plainly and without theatrics that to fire on the airport was to fire on the United Nations. There were moments of extreme tension. Turkish jets screamed low over the control tower, rattling windows, and nerves. Greek Cypriot snipers moved into the terminal buildings, their scopes trained on anything that moved. The Patricias stood their ground with that quiet, lethal professionalism, calm voices, steady hands, and weapons ready if diplomacy failed. They used their radios to negotiate local ceasefires while simultaneously preparing for a last stand defense of the runway. Veterans later recalled that Patricias were fully prepared to fight if either side pushed too far. They hoped it wouldn't come to that, but they were ready. Through sheer bluff, disciplined presence, and the unmistakable resolve of soldiers who knew exactly where the line was drawn, the PPCLI saved the airport. They prevented a massacre of civilians who had sought refuge in UN camps. They enforced a ceasefire that eventually led to the creation of the permanent Green Line, the buffer zone that still divides the island today. It was a master class in peace enforcement, proof that a peacekeeper is only effective if everyone involved understands that, when necessary, he is willing to become a combatant. Cyprus proved that the Patricias could hold fragile peace in the shadow of war, but the world was changing again. As the Cold War fractured old borders and new nations emerged from the ruins of Yugoslavia, the regiment would be called into a conflict far more chaotic and morally complex than anything they had faced since Korea. The Balkans were waiting, and the Patricias would soon find themselves in the Medak Pocket, where peacekeeping would once again become combat. This dual nature of the Patricia, the diplomat and the warrior, reached its breaking point in 1993 in the Medak Pocket of Croatia. The 2nd Battalion PPCLI deployed under the blue flag of the United Nations, expecting to monitor a ceasefire. Instead, they found themselves in the middle of a war zone during the Yugoslav wars, where ethnic hatred had burned away any pretense of restraint. Lieutenant Colonel Jim Calvin, the battalion commander, was ordered to move his men forward to enforce a ceasefire between Croatian forces and Serbian rebels. But as the Canadians advanced in their white-painted APCs, they were not met with cooperation, but with 20 mm cannon fire and rocket-propelled grenades from the Croatian army. The Croatians didn't think the Canadians were fight. They were wrong. For 15 hours, the Patricias engaged in sustained, high-intensity tactical firefight, the most serious combat the Canadian Army had seen since Korea. They used their C-7 rifles, M113 mounted machine guns, and disciplined fire and movement tactics to suppress Croatian bunkers. Their return fire was precise, so controlled that Croatian commanders were stunned to find themselves being pushed back by a force they had assumed would never shoot. When the Croatians attempted to halt the UN advance with a minefield and a tank-led roadblock, Jim Calvin made one of the most audacious decisions of the entire conflict. He held a press conference at the front line, standing in front of the cameras, with Croatian armor less than a kilometer away. Calmly, he told the international media exactly what the Croatians were doing: laying mines, blocking UN movement, violating the ceasefire. Behind him, his soldiers stood with weapons loaded, ready for the fight to resume at any moment. It worked. The Croatians backed down. When the Patricias finally forced their way into the villages out of the pocket, they discovered the true horror. The Croatians had carried out a scorched earth campaign. Houses were still burning, livestock lay dead in the roads, the bodies of civilians, men, women, and children, were scattered in fields and orchards. The smell of smoke and death hung over the valley. The Patricias spent the next several days documenting the atrocities with the same professionalism they had shown under fire. They photographed bodies, recorded testimony, and mapped the destruction, ensuring that the evidence reached the war crimes tribunals at The Hague. Their work would later become a key part of the international case against those responsible. For years, the Canadian government downplayed the Battle of the Medak Pocket because it did not fit the peaceful narrative of the 1990s. But the soldiers who were there never forgot what they saw or what they were forced to do. And in 2002, the 2nd Battalion was finally awarded the Commander-in-Chief Unit Commendation for their bravery under fire. It remains the most significant combat action of the Canadian Army between the Korean War and Afghanistan. A moment when the Patricias once again proved that peace is sometimes held not by the absence of force, but by the courage to use it when there is no other choice. The Medak Pocket marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The Patricias had proven once again that they could hold a line when the world around them was collapsing. But the 1990s were only a prelude to a new century shaped by a different kind of conflict, one without front lines, where the enemy hid in caves, compounds, and crowded cities, and where the mission could shift from humanitarian aid to fierce combat in the span of a single patrol. When the towers fell on September 11th, 2001, the world changed overnight. Canada answered the call, and once again the Patricias were among the first to step forward. They carried with them the lessons of Cyprus and the Balkans, the discipline of peacekeeping, the moral clarity forged in the Medak Pocket, and the hard earned understanding that sometimes the only way to protect the innocent is to confront those who would harm them. The regiment deployed to Afghanistan not as observers but as combat soldiers. They would fight in the mountains of Tora Bora, deserts of Kandahar, and the deadly maze of Panjwai. And in that harsh, unforgiving landscape, the Patricias would write a new chapter of courage, one that echoed the grit of Frezenberg, the resolve of Kapyong, and the steady professionalism that had defined them for a century. Afghanistan was waiting, and the Patricias once again were ready. In 2002, the 3rd Battalion PPCLI became the first Canadian combat troop to set foot in Afghanistan as part of Operation Apollo. They were paratroopers, light infantry specialists trained to move fast, hit hard, and operate in the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. In those early months, they found themselves clearing the caves of Tora Bora, patrolling the jagged ridgelines of the Hindu Kush, and hunting Taliban fighters who'd vanished into the mountains as quickly as they appeared. But it was in 2006, in the province of Kandahar, that the regiment faced its greatest challenge of the 21st century. The Taliban had regrouped, rearmed, and moved into the fertile green zone of the Panjwai district, a labyrinth of lush marijuana fields, deep irrigation ditches, and ancient khalats, mud brick fortresses with walls thick enough to swallow rifle fire. It was a landscape that seemed designed to swallow armies whole. The tactics had evolved again. The C7A2 rifle, fitted with optical sights and laser designators, allowed for lethal precision. The section attack, once built around the Bren gun and the Lee Enfield, now included the LAV-3, an 8-wheeled armored vehicle with 25 mm cannon capable of shredding a compound wall in seconds. But despite the technology, the fight remained brutally close in. The enemy was often just meters away, hidden behind grape rows, inside irrigation ditches, or deep within the maze of mud compounds. During Operation Medusa, the 1st Battalion found themselves in a landscape that felt like a nightmarish echo of Ortona. Close quarter fighting in a maze of fortified structures, except now the temperature hovered near 50 degrees Celsius. The Taliban were masters of the terrain. Every compound was a fortress, every ditch was a trench, every field was a potential ambush site. The Patricias had to fight for every meter, often under a sun so hot it warped the metal of their rifles. The dust of Kandahar became its own enemy. It was a fine talcum-like powder that coated everything. Clothing, weapons, lungs. It seeped into optics, jammed machine guns, and turned every breath into a reminder of where you were. It was here, in this harsh and unforgiving place, that the regiment suffered the loss of Captain Nicolas Godard, a forward observation officer, the eyes of the artillery. She was directing the fire during a massive firefight when her vehicle was struck. She became the first female Canadian soldier to die in combat. Her death shattered any lingering illusions about the nature of the mission. In the modern PPCLI, every soldier, regardless of role or gender, was an infantry soldier first. Veteran accounts from the Panjwai area describe a particular kind of Patricia pride, forged in heat, dust, and danger. One sergeant recalled, quote, "The dust was everywhere. You'd be clearing a grape drying hut, and your C7A2 felt like it weighed 100 pounds and you hadn't slept in 3 days. But you'd look at the guy next to you, see that red patch on his shoulder, and you just knew. You knew we weren't going anywhere. We were the Patricias. End quote. In the Panjwai, as in Flanders, Ortona, Kapyong, and the Medak Pocket, the regiment proved once again that courage is not a moment, it's a tradition carried forward by every soldier who wears the red patch. To further understand the PPCLI, one must understand the tools they used and how those tools shaped their spirit. In 1914, the originals carried the short magazine Lee Enfield. In the hands of a trained Patricia, this bolt-action rifle was a masterpiece. The British Army, and by extension the Canadians, were obsessed with the Mad Minute, the ability to fire 15 aimed rounds in 60 seconds. At the start of the Great War, infantry tactics were still rooted in the Napoleonic era, lines of men advancing with bayonets. But the SMLE, combined with the Vickers machine gun, changed the nature of the ground. The Patricias learned quickly that close-in fight required more than just a rifle. They became masters of the trench raid, darkened faces, wire cutters, and the knob carry or trench club. As the war progressed, the tactics shifted from the rigid line to the section attack. This was the birth of modern light infantry doctrine. By 1917, the Patricias were no longer just riflemen, they were specialists. They carried the Lewis gun, portable machine gun that allowed a small group of men to provide their own suppressing fire while others moved. This fire and movement is the DNA of the regiment. When the Second World War broke out, the technology had leapt forward, but the philosophy remained the same. The SMLE was replaced by the number 4 Lee Enfield and the Lewis gun by the iconic Bren. Bren gun changed everything for the PPCLI. It was accurate, reliable, and allowed the section to become a lethal, self-contained unit. In the hills of Sicily and the streets of Ortona, the Patricias perfected the O group or the orders group and the decentralized command. If an officer fell, a corporal took over. If the corporal fell, private knew the objective. This was the light infantry spirit. Every man a leader, every man a master of his weapon. In Italy, this culminated in mouseholing. The Patricias realized that the narrow streets of Ortona were death traps, so instead of using the roads, they used beehive charges to blow the holes through the interior walls of connecting houses. They fought through the buildings, clearing room by room, never stepping foot in the line of sight of a German sniper. This was a tactical evolution born of necessity, proving that the Patricia was a thinking soldier. We're going to move on now to Victoria Cross recipients within the PPCLI. The Victoria Cross is the highest award for gallantry in the face of the enemy. It's not given lightly. It is earned in moments where the line between life and death narrows to a breath, and a single soldier's courage alters the course of a battle. 3 men serving with PPCLI have received this honor, each representing a different era of the regiment's sacrifice, and I want to talk about these guys today. First, there is Sergeant George Harry Mullen, Passchendaele, 1917. During the mud-soaked nightmare of Passchendaele, the Patricias were ordered to capture a series of reinforced German pillboxes. One particular sniper's post and machine gun nest were inflicting devastating casualties, pinning down the advance. Sergeant George Mullen decided he would end it himself. Under relentless fire, he crawled forward alone, inching his way through the mud that swallowed rifles and boots and men alike. Reaching the pillbox, though, he climbed onto the roof, exposed to every enemy weapon in range. With his revolver, he shot the 2 snipers inside, then dropped down to force the surrender of the remaining 10 defenders. When he returned to his lines, his uniform was riddled with bullet holes, but he was unscathed. His actions broke the deadlock and saved countless lives. For this, he received the Victoria Cross. And then there is Sergeant Aubrey Cousins from the Netherlands in 1945. In the final winter of the Second World War, the Patricias were fighting through the Netherlands, clearing German strongpoints one farmstead at a time. At the hamlet of Moeshof, Sergeant Aubrey Cousins' platoon was torn apart by heavy machine gun fire, leaving him in command of only 4 survivors. He refused to yield. He sprinted across open ground to a supporting tank, climbed onto the exposed exterior, and directed its fire onto the German positions with calm precision. Then, dismounting, he charged alone into 3 enemy-held houses. He cleared each one in turn, killing or capturing 20 German soldiers and breaking the defense that had halted the advance. Moments after securing the final building, he was struck down by a sniper's bullet. His courage transformed a near disaster into a decisive victory, and for this, he was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. And then we have Lieutenant Robert Hampton Gray from Ongawa Bay, Japan, 1945. Although he served as a naval aviator, Lieutenant Robert Gray is honored within the broader Patricia family for the simple reason that courage recognizes no single branch of service. On August 9, 1945, Gray led a flight of Corsair fighter bombers against Japanese naval forces anchored in Onagawa Bay. His aircraft was hit repeatedly by anti-aircraft fire, flames trailing from his engine. He could have broken off and saved his life. Instead, he pressed on. With his burning aircraft barely holding together, Gray lined up on a Japanese destroyer and released his bomb at point-blank range, sinking the ship before crashing into the sea. His body was never recovered. For his unwavering determination in the face of certain death, he was awarded the Victoria Cross, the last Canadian to receive the honor in the Second World War. Together, the stories of Mullen, Cousins, and Gray form more than a record of extraordinary bravery. They trace the arc of a regiment's character across generations. 3 men in 3 different wars, facing 3 impossible moments, each chose the same path, forward. Mullen in the mud of Passchendaele climbing a pillbox under a storm of bullets. Cousins in the frozen Netherlands charging alone into houses filled with enemy fire. And Gray in the burning skies over Japan steering a dying aircraft into one final decisive strike. Their courage was not identical, but it was unmistakably cut from the same cloth. It was that quiet, unyielding conviction that the mission mattered, that their comrades mattered, and that fear would not be the thing that defined them. These men earned the Victoria Cross, but they also embodied something deeper, something that every Patricia understands the moment they put on the red patch. Once a Patricia, always a Patricia. A bond that outlives battles, a legacy carried forward not by medals, but by the spirit behind them. As we look across a century of service, the evolution of tactics tells the story of the regiment's adaptability. In 1914, the Patricia was a rifleman, a master of the bolt-action SMLE. His world was one of fixed lines and bayonet charges where courage was measured in the ability to stand in a trench under a rain of iron. By 1951, he was a mountain fighter at Kapyong, holding a frozen hill against impossible odds. By 1974, he was a diplomat warrior in Cyprus, standing between 2 enemies with nothing but a blue beret and his resolve. By 1993, he was a witness to history in the Medak Pocket, documenting atrocities while returning fire with disciplined precision. And by 2006, he was a high-tech vanguard in the dust of Kandahar, fighting in a landscape where ancient mud walls met modern optics and armored vehicles. What is the thread that connects them? It isn't the uniform, it isn't the weapon, it isn't even the battlefield. It's a specific kind of Canadian professional excellence, a quiet, steady competence that does not seek the spotlight, only the mission. It's the understanding that when things are at their absolute worst, when the line is buckling and the world is falling apart, the Patricias will be there. They have been the first to go, the last to leave, and the steadiest in the fire. Afghanistan reaffirmed that truth. For more than a decade, the regiment fought, patrolled, mentored, and endured in a land where the enemy was often unseen, and the mission changed with every rotation. They carried the weight of a nation's expectations, and they bore the losses that came with it, quietly, professionally, without fanfare. When the last Canadians withdrew in 2014, the dust of Kandahar clung to their uniforms and their memories. The war had changed them. just as it had changed Canada. But through every ambush, every foot patrol, and every long night in a forward operating base, the Patricias upheld the same standard that had carried them through Frezenberg, Ortona, Kapyong, Cyprus, and the Medak Pocket. Today, the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry remains one of the core fighting formations of the Canadian Army. Their mission has evolved, but their purpose has not. They serve at home, responding to floods, fires, and natural disasters. They train the next generation of soldiers in Edmonton, Shiloh, and Wainwright. They deploy abroad on NATO missions, UN operations, and multinational exercises. They stand watch in Eastern Europe, reinforcing Canada's commitment to collective defense. They patrol the Arctic, adapting to a frontier that is changing faster than at any time in our history. The tools have changed, the uniforms have changed, the battlefields have changed, but the spirit hasn't. As you walk past a cenotaph or see a soldier with that red shoulder patch, remember George Mullen, remember Aubrey Cousins, and remember Jim Calvin, Nicola Goddard. They are the living embodiment of a promise made in 1914, a promise that Canada would always have a vanguard. The regiment was born as a gift to the nation, and for over 100 years they have been the nation's shield. The princess would be proud, the originals would be proud, and the Rick-a-Dam-Doo still flies, carried by the first in the field. This story of courage, of sacrifice, and of quiet professionalism belongs not only to the regiment, but to those who never came home, to the men who stood in the mud of Flanders, to the Patricias who held the line at Frezenberg, to those who fell in the shattered streets of Ortona, to the soldiers who fought through the night at Kapyong, to the peacekeepers who gave their lives in the service as strangers, to the witnesses of the Medak Pocket who carried the weight of what they saw, to the warriors of Kandahar who walked into the dust and did not return. Their names are carved in stone across a century of Canadian history, but their legacy lives in the regiment they helped forge. Every Patricia who wears the red patch walks in their footsteps. Every march, every patrol, every act of service is a continuation of the promise they kept with their lives. We remember them not for how they died, but for how they lived. Steadfast, loyal, and unbroken. This work is dedicated to all members of Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry who made the ultimate sacrifice. May their memory endure, may their stories be told, and may the Rick-a-Dam-Doo fly forever in their honor. A century of service, a legacy of courage, and a regiment that continues to stand ready. Thank you for joining me in honoring the story of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. Their watch goes on. You can find me on the internet at www.memoryandvalor.ca. Remember, that's valor with an O-U-R. Also on TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. And if you dig really deep, maybe even LinkedIn. I have just released a new book. It is available on Amazon as a Kindle and paperback format, and also for the first time on Kobo as an ebook. This is a brand new book that I've written in honor of my dad, who served with PPCLI for several years and did a couple of tours in Cyprus in the 70s. The title of the book is Once a Patricia, Always a Patricia, The Origins and Brief History of the PPCLI. I would be absolutely delighted if you had a look at that and got yourself a copy. This book is really near and dear to my heart for obvious reasons. So thanks for joining me here today on this really incredible, very Canadian journey. And keep history alive, because where memory endures, valor lives on.